Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Shadowlands video. So, melee DPS, I think it's one of the most fun ways to play the game. Like really, the mobility is such a great strength, and yeah, the range requirement does exist to make up for that, but it leaves the game feeling, I think, a lot more action-oriented in the day-to-day gameplay, and that can be really exciting. So, if you're here, you probably know all about how great it feels to be a melee class, so you might be wondering, which one do I play? How are they changing in Shadowlands? Which spec? Well, in this video, we're going to run through every single DPS class and spec in the game. We're going to give you our subjective thoughts. We're going to talk about the core changes and a bit about how each feels and some detail of the fundamental strengths and weaknesses. Now, this, of course, is based on what we have played during the Shadowlands Alpha, so we don't have the full picture just yet, and today we're focusing on the baseline classes, not with legendaries and stuff. So, look, we can't tell you what to play, but we can help you make an informed choice and also give you a general lay of the land. Now, if you want to support what we're doing, well, there's a few ways to do that. One of the best ones, of course, is Patreon, where there's a big stack of monthly loot. Today, though, I think the natural thing to highlight is one thing in that big loot stack, which is the class pins. Here's the Mage one from March, the Shaman one from February. It's actually Paladin this month, so yeah, if you're watching this in May, it's Paladin month now. Yeah, so if you're into the classes, then hey, the Patreon's a cool place to get some loot, and also, of course, to help out our team, which we really do appreciate, and all your support has been such an incredible morale boost for everyone. Seriously, we're firing on all cylinders these days. So that's how to support us. I hope you enjoy this video, and with that, let's get stuck in. Alright, let's kick off today's affairs with the Death Knight. With two fairly reliable melee DPS specs and a self-sufficient tank spec as backup, they are rarely a bad choice as a class. They're never going to get their Wrath of the Lich King levels of strength back, but they are generally super solid, unless you like moving fast. Death's Advance still does ensure you don't go below 70% speed, but you very rarely go above 100%, so yes, you can feel rather left in the dust. The Shadowlands changes don't shore up this weakness. Instead, though, their strengths are improved, though I guess you will be getting some more movement abilities via your Covenant general ones like the Ardenweald one. Anyway, there's Lichborn, Anti-Magic Zone, and Sacrificial Pact, which are there across the board for the DKs. That should be great, give you more ways to stay alive, so hopefully then they will feel just a little bit more like the inevitable death that they are trying to portray. With that, let's get into the specs. Frost DKs have not seen a huge amount of change, but they have got some new toys. So there's the ability to use a two-handed weapon. That's going to be really nice. I'd say mainly for just the transition between specs, right? Like you've got a big Unholy 2H, now you can use it as Frost. That's pretty cool. Then Hypothermic Presence is a new talent that halves runic power cost, and thankfully is not on the GCD. Frostworm's Fury going baseline is also a helpful change, I think. The variety also of the new runes that you can forge gives you some, at least theoretically, interesting choices, which is kind of cool. As for how it feels, though, I mean, yeah, it's not really that much different. You know, you're spending your runes on Obliterate, your Runic Power, and Frost Strike while using your Howling Blast procs, your Pillar of Frost, and Remorseless Winter as is necessary. You know, it's what you're used to. It's far from exciting, and the lack of baseline AoE spenders can be quite frustrating, but I do think it's a satisfying enough spec. I mean, making use of Pillar of Frost, stacking strength by timing hits alongside any talented abilities, that's, you know, it's enough to keep things interesting, I think. It's not super deep, but it's just, you know, a solid core that's pretty fun, I would say. Now, it does, however, have some historical balance concerns with talents, and this is where, of course, Breath of Sindragosa appears. Now, I think that running Breath is a really fun playstyle, but also feeling locked into that, well, that often doesn't really feel that good, because if you mess it up, you really are punished, and sometimes you want freedom to not have that playstyle. Now, aside from that particular nuisance, Frost should feel pretty good in most scenarios and content. Its main weakness, of course, is the lack of movement and the lack of some combat utility, but those aside, it is a satisfying, solid choice, and I think it continues to be so in Shadowlands. Next up, we've got Unholy. So, it's got Summon Gargoyle baseline, that's pretty sweet, and that means that their bottom talent row has been revamped a bit. There's nothing mega substantial for a, you know, from a gameplay perspective there, but definitely having access to Summon Gargoyle default is going to be pretty sweet. Then Army of the Dead making Apocalypse summon in the Magus, that's like a nice little flavorful addition there. Then Unholy Pack, you know, that filling the empty slot, that is a little bit lackluster, I will say, and it bolsters the power of Dark Transformation by adding strength. death, and including the Hell Chains Azerite trait. So I guess there's that going on. Overall though, with this, I'd say that Unholy basically just feels like a mildly improved version of the BFA one. Now, losing Fester might, that is a negative, although I suspect its popularity means it will return as a legendary effect. Of course, can't guarantee that though. In any case though, expect them to be wild in AoE, just, not as wild as they were before. Now, as far as it, just playing in general, keeping up your Virulent Plague while creating the wounds and then popping the wounds, I think that's a really satisfying base, and I think that doing so while making use of Gargoyle and Apocalypse feels great, and that's where the strength of baseline Gargoyle really does come into play. Now, their AoE is also really nice, although having to talent into Epidemic is kind of a pain there. Now, there is a bit of a ramp up in applying your wounds before popping them, but I think the payoff of popping them, like all at once in AoE, I think it really is quite great indeed. Unholy, therefore, I think is a strong spec in many situations. It's got some similar strengths to Frost, but it's also then got the really, really good AoE and burst. Now, the weaknesses are also there, right? Like, it does take a little bit of build up, and of course, it still is a DK, so it doesn't really move that fast. Now, target swapping with this one can be a bit frustrating because, of course, you've got that need to build up the wounds before you pop them to do the deep, so there is that baked in. But overall, I'd say that, if being a little bit slow and bringing little except for Death Grip and AMZ, if that's not an issue for you, then Unholy is probably one of the most enjoyable picks in this video. And also, hey, you're playing a Death Knight in Shadowlands, so it kind of just fits, doesn't it? Havoc Demon Hunter. Do we really need this segment? Look, I mained a Demon Hunter in 8.3, and frankly, I think the Demon Hunters are basically just completely overpowered, and I think that's just going to continue because it's kind of baked into how Blizzard designed them. So yes, you know what, play a Demon Hunter, there's little reason not to. In all seriousness, right, like we've not seen much of a big change, right? Immolation Aura, that's now baseline, which is kind of a nice addition, but then the extra Fury component, that's still on the talent tree, so you haven't really gained that much. Now, in terms of other things like Blur, it got nerfed to a 20% damage reduction down from 35. That'll certainly be felt. It's still got the 10-second duration on a 1-minute cooldown with 50% dodge, though, so yes, it's very strong still. Then Demonic Appetite, that makes Soul Frags reduce the cooldown of I-Beam to a point, which is a returning Azerite trait and Legion legendary effect. Now, Demonic got a 2-second nerf. That's definitely going to sting. Not really a fan of that. Soul Rending giving only 5% leech baseline and 25% in meta. That also means their survivability is going down a bit, but they haven't really lost anything in terms of new weaknesses or core strengths going away, I would say. And as much as that demonic and maybe that's like the soul rending, as much as those being a bit weaker, to me as somebody who's playing a DH, that kind of sucks. But at the same time, I then remember how absurdly overpowered I feel just about all the time and think, yeah, maybe I actually do deserve that. Now, their core, right, it's basically intact. Demon's Bite, Immolation Aura, get your Fury up, spam that in your Blade Dance, your Chaos Strike, I-Beam when you can. Then you've got the Momentum build, which does exist to weave in your Fell Rush and your Vengeful Retreat. But if that's, you know what, I actually think the problem there is it's really fun, but just not in World of Warcraft, right? It's like a fun thing for another game because it just ends up being a little bit too clumsy to use in many scenarios. So yeah, the Momentum build still exists, but otherwise it basically is the same. Now there is Essence Break, which is the new version of Dark Slash that basically is just a lot more usable, and I really do hope that it gets talented into more because I think that would open up a bit more of a, for me, fun playstyle. It's a bit more in-depth. So overall, Shadowlands Havoc, it might use the same satisfying but boring enough rotation of BFA. Now, as a positive, there are tools for every situation, pretty much. You've got dependable single target, you've got great AoE damage, you don't have a big ramp up. Now, they're far from perfect, but if you want survivability, CC, lots of mobility, lots of damage, then the Havoc Demon Hunter is an easy choice. As we've covered, Druids have seen a bunch of their utility returned, including Heart of the Wild, and this is going to be pretty nice for the Ferals. Really, this era of Druids making up for other players' mistakes is kind of back, but just in a bit more of a limited way. So that is pretty cool. Now, the feral part of Druid does, however, remain one of the most troubled specs in the game. Like, it feels good at its core, I'd say. Snapshotting dots with Tiger's Fury while managing your incoming energy and combo points, I think that does make for enjoyable core gameplay. It just does suffer, though, from a wealth of issues. The easy gameplay option of Sabretooth is kind of just too strong, in a way. It makes Ferocious Bite extend even snapshotted rips, and that just leads you with this just kind of like mind-numbingly boring single-target spec, basically. Now, with a few targets, they're still fun when you're multi-dotting, but of course, when you're dealing with targets that don't live for that long, they're basically just reduced to one button, thrash. So that's a little bit unfortunate in AoE. And then when I think about, say, talents, I mean, they're one of those specs that just has that issue of, right, like, they have lots of great options, but those options are all just in the same talent row, and there's sometimes times where you sort of would want multiple of them. Now, in terms of changes, the Druid has utility changes, but the only major change to Feral is the Blood Talons change, and this is a bit more of a controversial one. It now increases the damage of the next two rips or ferocious bites by 30% after using Shred, Rake, and Thrash within 3 seconds, right? So it's a bit of a combo there. Now, this is a big change, and it does feel quite awkward. Having to use Thrash on single target isn't going to feel good for a start, and this has generally been received by players as a worse version of the old, a worse iteration on what Blood Talons is, with, of course, the older version that was based off using regrowth being, I think, a lot more well received by people. I think this is really not good right now, and I mean, that's also given that the major player complaint of Sabretooth and its overpoweredness and its sort of dominating single target and being really boring, that hasn't been addressed. So you've got this situation where it's like, if you're doing Blood Talons, right, they're a bit harder to play, but they're not really rewarded for that extra challenge in terms of damage in basically any situation. And that means that it's basically extremely hard to recommend Feral unless you're a diehard fan of the gameplay or the fantasy. I think being a Druid is its own strength. You've got all that great utility and versatility, but at the end of the day, there are just, I think, easier to play options that get better results, that have less design issues, and that's just going to be, I mean, that is kind of the story of Feral. It has been the story of Feral for quite some time. I think it's just a more extreme version of it now because the Sabretooth issue still does exist, and that even though Blizzard are trying to iterate in Blood Talons, it still is kind of just a bit problematic. I mean, this more recent version, I really don't think it's that good of a design. So, yeah, there you go. That's what's up for Feral. We're not looking too good right now. Certainly, more iteration is needed over the alpha. Survival Hunter, I think, is another sort of troubled spec. It's actually one of the least played specs in the game by most metrics, and I think sometimes for good reason, right? Like, it doesn't really bring that much special to the table, and I'd also say that baseline, it's not that fun. Now, I will say that personally, if I am taking the Mongoose Bite and Wildfire Infusion talents, I think it's way more enjoyable, but that's actually adding a bunch of complexity, and you're not really gaining that much, right? I mean, yeah, it's just that this spec overall, it doesn't really offer advantages over playing the Hunter range specs. The core is basically just keeping Kill Command rolling and your Serpent Sting up, and then dumping focus on Raptor Strike or pooling it up for your Mongoose Bites. And at least with the Mongoose, you do get a little gameplay loop there to think about. To be honest with you though, I mean, I've got to say, I did prefer the Legion version when you got a bit more haste, when you could use your artifact ability to kind of capitalize on the big crispy Mongoose Bites. Now, Shadowlands fundamentally improves nothing here, right? Basically, this is a spec that right now doesn't feel well designed unless you take 2 talents. I think it's got a messy talent tree, and there's basically no reason to pick this if you want to play a melee DPS, because there's lots of other melee DPS that just, I think, do a better job. I think Hunter's a really solid class for ranged if you want to do that, but for melee, it does just sort of lose some of its advantages. Now, that said, this is not awful in most cases. It's just a situation where it rarely excels. It rarely feels like it's in its groove. So, look, if you like the fantasy of a melee hunter, you can still make this work in the majority of content. But I do think that this does need another look on Blizzard's end, and honestly, I wouldn't really recommend playing it like in Shadowlands unless you already in BFA would consider yourself to be a major fan of this spec. Windwalker time, you know what, it's a spec that I mained for quite some time, and in many ways it is still actually pretty darn good. I think it does have this really nice flow to it, especially when you're using the Whirling Dragon Punch talent. I think there's also just something about the chi generation from Tiger Palm being spread across the other abilities as they come off cooldown that just feels right, like you're kind of weaving between them. I actually think it does get that martial arts feel. It's also, of course, because it's a monk, it's got plenty of great movement, and there's also really strong utility in the right hands. Now, the addition of Zhuan baseline is also really nice, and Dance of Chi-Ji that sort of replaces it in the talent tree, that's a really fun talent to play with. Those free spinning crane kicks, they do feel good to use, and they give you plenty of time to plan out your next few button presses. Now, the old Touch of Death returning, that is a little bit contentious, but I think it is a super fun ability to make use of. Now, there are issues here, right? Like Zhuan being a bit boring, and the last talent row being mostly wasted. Obvious room for improvement there, Bliss. Overall, though, I'd say that if monks were rewarded for their effort in gameplay, I'd actually rank this as like a very, very high up spec. But like with the Feral Druid, sometimes it does feel like you're putting in twice the work of some other classes and you're not really gaining anything for it. I'd say, though, if you like the monk fantasy and you want a strong melee DPS, right, then yeah, this is a pretty darn solid one. I think it's a good choice. Now, if you want to just have all the same benefits, be more tanky and probably do more damage, then, I mean, just play the Demon Hunter, and that, I think, is just infinitely the issue of the Demon Hunter, where it's so simple but so powerful, and Blizzard are kind of just committed to it being like that, so it just ends up being this mega strong option pretty much all the time, which is a little bit wild. Anyway, with that said, let's move on. Retribution Paladin is one of the specs best covered by the Unpruning. They see the return of Auras, Baseline Consecration, Hammer of Wrath, which is just a fun classic, and Wake of Ashes, which of course just looks awesome. They also get Blessing of Sacrifice and Word of Glory, which is now a single target holy power heal. And all of these are real nice improvements to their toolkit. Gotta be real with you, pretty cool. Now, Retribution's core gameplay is pretty simple though. Fundamentally, it's a sort of first come, first serve situation, trying to generate as much holy power as you can over the course of a fight without wasting any of it. Now, with Consecration then helping you to fill any downtime, I'd say that playing Ret in Shadowlands, like, yeah, it does feel pretty darn good. It's not the most exciting thing in the universe, but I think it's really solid, and it does have that nice strength of having some hybrid utility. Having access to Lay on Hands, Word of Glory, Sacrifice, Freedom, and your auras, that means that you can react to emergencies really well and help out your team. And to so many players, that is going to be just such a strong fantasy, right? A thing that they as individuals can be known for that's actually enabled by how this spec is. A Focus Paladin can be extremely clutch, and it's one of the classes that feels like best able to have this supporting role for its team. It's not really weak in any situation, thanks to its large toolkit as well, meaning that it's a reliable pick. It does, though, have two major downsides. One is that it's only really exciting when its back is against the wall and its emergency buttons are necessary. Then the other downside would be the absolute lack of mobility. Well, it's not absolute, right? You do have your Divine Steed, 100% move speed for 3 seconds once every 45 seconds. So the Wheelchair Paladin meme is extremely real compared to, you know, the rest of the classes who've got jumps, blinks, leaps, sprints. The Paladins, yeah, you know, they're just walking. That's kind of what they do. Now, that said, you could get your teleport or via the Venthyr signature Covenant ability, you could turn into a slightly more speedy fox with a blink if you're using the, the Arden Wield one. So there are some options there if you really want that movement. But yeah, I mean, the wheelchair meme is still real. Overall, though, I've got to say, this is a really reliable spec. It's a really solid pick. And overall, it's, I think, got better with Shadowlands because of that unpruning. And it really will help you help your team. And I think that will be really empowering and satisfying to many players. Alright, it's Rogue time, the only class that exclusively does melee DPS, and that means that you do have 3 whole chances at a spec that you actually enjoy playing. Now, for the core changes here, they've had Poisons and Slice and Dice returned baseline across the board, and that basically gives every spec a new maintenance buff, which to some people is good, to other people less good. Shiv is then also baseline, adding a strong on-demand slow or dispel for most, and then doing a bit more for Assassination. There's then Crimson Vial, which is a a 20% heal down from a 30% one, so that's going to hurt a bit. However, there is the proposed pickpocket reagent stuff to improve your Crimson Vial, which could make up for this, so there is that going on, but in actual sustained combat, you may feel a little bit weaker because of that change. Anyway, that's the baseline stuff. Let's get into the specs themselves. So Assassination has got Toxic Blade baseline as an added passive to their Shiv, and this really does solidify that as a core part of their gameplay, and I think a pretty cool one. They also have Ambush back to open from Stealth with a Bang, which is pretty sweet, and then Blindside now procs free ambushes instead of adding a new ability. Now really, that addition of Toxic Blade, that being baseline, I think that's really good because that was a super commonly picked talent anyway, so I'm pretty happy about that. Now, playing Assassination generally does feel quite fun, at least on a target or two. Fitting your Envenoms into the Shiv window is really fun there, right? The pace kind of ratchets up a bit. But then you do have the addition of Slice and Dice that causes a little bit of a problem there, just in terms of it being a maintenance buff, which you may or may not enjoy, depending on what type of player you are. Now, keeping up Garrote, Rupture, and Slice of Dice, doing all of those things is like the stuff you've got to do for the spec to work. Sometimes that doesn't really allow for your Shiv to feel fully maximized. There kind of just is sometimes that feeling where there's a little bit too much maintenance before you're kind of doing the more self-expression, like trying to eke as much out of the spec as you can. Now, there is the thing that on AoE, it gets significantly less fun. Multi-dotting bleeds is okay, but the only way that it feels like you're doing proper AoE is by pressing Fan of Knives and hoping for a poison application. Now, the talented options don't really help with that either, as Crimson Tempest and Hidden Blades aren't very good, and then Poison Bomb is, well, passive and also unreliable, so not really a great choice. Overall then, Assassination Rogue will probably feel strong and enjoyable on, a target or three, but will feel not particularly good outside of that. Overall though, it is a good enough DPS spec. It's one that I do enjoy in single target and cleave. I probably just wouldn't main it because of the AoE issue. Alright, next up there's Outlaw. So this is another example of a spec being fun, but being held back by a few frustrations, and I guess they are fairly major. Now, major frustration of BFA was helped out here in Shadowlands by them adding a cooldown and removing the combo point cost of Roll the Bones. Now, this basically means you don't have to be re-rolling all the time, so it sort of slows down that part of the gameplay and gives the rest of the specs gameplay a bit more room to breathe. But it is, though, a very band-aid situation, right? It's a blunt way of stopping the re-rolling problem, but of course, yeah, you will be stuck with a bad roll a little bit more often, so that's not going to feel really that good. So, there's I think one step forward, but really, one step back, right? I think just there are some fundamentals of Roll the Bones that a lot of people would like to have, looked at. Now, the other major change then is Between the Eyes. It now debuffs the target, which means that basically it's like a damage window. So this basically adds Between the Eyes to your rotation all the time. That is, of course, much like an Azerite trait did in BFA. Now, the debuff does not have 100% uptime, so it very much is just a window there. Now, I personally think that this spec is something that is still being worked on because some of the changes just sort of interfere with each other. Now, there is one last notable change, and that is the Blade Flurry is now down to 1 charge, but right? In return, it is impacted by Restless Blades. Now, that is the effect that just reduces the cooldown of stuff whenever your combo points are spent, and that, of course, also will apply to Roll the Bones. Now, also, they're making it so that whenever you cast Blade Flurry, it's not going off the global cooldown. A lot of people won't be happy about that, but at least now, whenever you cast it, you will do an AoE attack. So Blade Flurry is actually also an attack. Now, the core thing here is basically that you will have pretty strong average levels of uptime for Blade Flurry. However, because you can't pull 2 charges, you can't really save it up for a big AoE burst. All in all, though, I'd say that Outlaw is not mega different. It is still a basic combo point, sort of energy management spec with some procs to react to. I think the real fun does come from Roll the Bones changing up the flow of gameplay when you get the fun buffs, and that does, I think, still happen often enough. And when that does happen, I think it is really quite fun. But sometimes there are points of frustration in that system, and I'd say also the target cap that Blizzard have put on Blade Flurry and pretty much all the big AoEs that will reduce your big burst AoE strength a bit, which maybe will tone down a point of fun for many players. Now, that said, it still does keep most of its original strength. It can easily swap targets with nearly no penalty, although the Between the Eyes debuff sort of does limit that a little bit. Still, though, I think this is probably going to remain pretty darn strong in Mythic Plus by virtue of it being a rogue that can also do strong single target and AoE without having to do a whole bunch of talent swapping. Next up, it's time to deal with the subs. So, the dead spec of BFA Subtlety killed in cold blood after an unfortunate dance with encounter design. It was a bit rough, wasn't it? Now, the changes here are interesting, with the ignoring armor debuff Find Weakness actually now being a core part of the gameplay. So, Find Weakness, that now applies from critical backstabs from behind and critical shuriken storms, as well as from any stealth attack. Now, slipping past armor with a well-placed dagger, it's a fun fantasy for the sneaky rogues. So, yeah, I mean, having it baseline is great, even if it's not the most fun thing in the universe. Now, Eviscerates on debuffed targets will do some extra shadow damage, but there's really not much to do with it except stay behind your target unless you've taken Gloomblade. Then for Shadow Dance, it actually has been sort of, I'd say, de-emphasized a little bit from core gameplay, but so basically, right, you'll be doing less of them, but they will be more important. So it's now a single charge, it gets less cooldown reduction, but in exchange for that, some of the bonus damage from the Dark Shadow talent is actually baked in. Now, oddly enough, that talent still does exist in the tree and just increases the bonus damage a bit more, which honestly seems a bit pointless, but the talent tree is maybe still just a work in progress. Now, as for the other changes, Nightblade has been changed back to being called Rupture, and it no longer increases damage taken by the target. It is actually just a regular bleed, and I think that is a good change. Now, the major new addition here is a proposed solution to their AoE woes. So, instead of AoE being Shuriken Storm into Eviscerate or maybe spreading Ruptures around, they now have a new AoE finisher called Shadow Vault, and this is actually quite interesting because it ties into Find Weakness. So, basically, right, Shadow Vault, it's just a jumping Shuriken Storm, basically, but the point is that it does more damage to the targets who have Find Weakness on them. Yes, it's far from subtle doing a backflip with loads of shurikens, but in terms of how it plays, I think it's a little bit more fun. It's a little bit more of something for your AoE, which I guess is pretty good. As for how it plays then, well, the core of Subtlety gameplay is largely unchanged, right? You want to line up your symbols of death and eviscerates while keeping Rupture and now Slice and Dice up. There is enough there to make it engaging to play regularly, I would say. On the AoE, though, it is just Shuriken Storm into your Ruptures or your Shadow Vault, which, I mean, is, I'd say, unremarkable, right? It's not particularly on, like, I guess, on brand for the fantasy of this spec, I would say. So there's that, but I guess there was a little bit more for the AoE, and I do like that it ties into Find Weakness, so that is an area where I think Blizzard could probably get even more good gameplay benefits if they had maybe more of a look at how the talents impacted that. So personally, though, I would say that I enjoy Sub about as much as Assassination in most cases. I think it just doesn't really do anything super special. I mean, they used to be able to funnel AoE damage to a priority target, but that, of course, was changed in patch 8.1, and that kind of gutted the spec for a while. They now, I guess, don't really seem like they've got anything to excel at. They're just sort of another flavor of very default bread and butter, right, melee DPS, and I guess I do find them a little bit hard to recommend, despite enjoying them well enough, because it does feel like just a bit of a black sheep of the rogue family as a whole. Like, it just does need a bit more love, a bit more care. So yeah, I guess, like with a lot of other specs, it might not excel, but certainly, yeah, it should be playable. Then next up, we've got enhancements. So after an outright miserable BFA of being subpar and having gameplay that didn't really work that well, the enhancement shamans saw core changes, and like with Elemental, the Maelstrom resource, it is gone, and they now manage everything via cooldowns. Yeah, it's quite old school, I guess. So yeah, in terms of what they've got, right, they've now got this stacking Maelstrom weapon effect that can give them some instant casts, which I think is, I mean, it's cool. It's not mega well utilized right now, but I think it's a cool mechanic for them to have. Now, on top of that, they've also got their old Lightning Shield, Wind Fury, and Flame Tongue buffs back, as well as Wind Fury, Searing, and Healing Totems, so that's pretty good. Most everything else, though, is similar enough. Now, sadly, the more that we deeply looked into this, there's a major issue that it doesn't really fix, and that is that Storm Strike just makes up for too much of their damage. And basically, as a result of really trying to feel fast and cool and really doubling down on the Storm Strike for its damage, it kind of doesn't really flow that well, right? Now this spec basically, right, it's a massive stack of weak buttons to press while Storm Strike is not a thing that you can press. That's kind of the core of it. Now Maelstrom weapon stacks for an instant cast spell, that's pretty nice, except that using them offensively sometimes just feels too weak to even bother using a GCD on. Using the full 5 stacks to heal is a lot more expensive than before since, you know, the Maelstrom cost used to be very low. So basically, there's bits of this that just feel a little bit unfinished, even though I definitely do think that initially it felt a lot better to me than BFA. I guess I was hopeful coming into Alpha and getting some, like, hands-on with enhancement. I was quite excited by that, but I think a little bit more work is needed for it to be just better realized. Now, as for its inherent strengths and weaknesses, I would say it's still fun to play for a start. That is a good thing. It works perfectly well in single target, and I think especially well in grouped AoE because of the genuinely super fun Crash Lightning ability that I think is just so cool. I love it. Now, the utility that comes from their totems is also pretty cool. So there's Healing Stream, then of course you can do instant chain heals from your Maelstrom weapon building up. That's pretty cool. There's Wind Fury, there's Earth Elemental. That's all very valuable stuff, I would say. Sadly though, they're just a little bit overshadowed in general. So for now, I would say choose it with caution, right? Unless you really enjoy how it plays. But Blizzard are making a lot of changes here. I think they're moving in interesting directions, and I do think there's actually quite a bit of hope for this one indeed. And finally, time for the last class on our list, the Warrior. So for the DPS specs, right, you've got Shield Block, Spell Reflect, and Ignore Pain being baselined as defensive options, with Shield Slam being there to support you if you are using a shield. On the opposite side then, on the offensive side, Shattering Throw and Intervene are also back for utility, and Impending Victory has been buffed to heal 30% from 20. So overall, pretty cool stuff, I'd say. And really strong tools, right? Now, Ignore Pain does cost a lot of rage, but having that option I think is great. Intervene, of course, will give you some more mobility, which is also going to be super fun. Now, they still don't have a baseline stun, so that's something you'll have to deal with. It is, though, usually a fairly reliable class, right? Including being more mobile than a plate wearer typically is. But I guess, of course, for more context, more information, we've got to hop into the specs in Shadowlands, and we're going to kick it off with arms. First up, we've got Arms. So in terms of changes, Arms saw some notable ones to the talents. Cleave has no cooldown, but it is only usable after Whirlwind hits multiple targets, which makes their sustained AoE play just a little bit different. Then Deadly Cam is no longer duration-based. Instead, it actually makes the next 4 rage spenders free. And that does give you a bit more versatility, right, when, you know, the free buttons are being mixed in, so I think that's pretty cool. Now, one of the most fun changes is Ravager, because it no longer replaces Blade Storm, so you can get them both going. Then also it does give Arms like a pretty huge source of rage on demand. And in terms of utility, right, like another cool thing is, yeah, you can go just giga all your AoE at once, but it also gives you the choice if you want to pace out your AoE, right? You know, use Ravager in one pack, Blade Storm in another one. Pretty cool. Generally, I think though, past that, Arms is still the same as BFA, right? Overpower when it resets, line things up with Colossus Strike, do some meaty Mortal Strikes. That is still the core. These changes though, they clean it up a little bit, they make it feel better, but it still, you know, is what it is. If you think that that slower sort of, you know, single two-handed swords style is a bit boring, it still is going to feel a bit boring for you, but if it's something you like, then there are some cool changes here to support that core fantasy and support what the class is doing, so I think that's actually pretty, pretty good. Now, in terms of other things, well, Sweeping Strikes is still on the global cooldown. That is infuriating as hell. Either it should be off the global cooldown, or it should be a powerful AoE attack in and of itself whenever you hit that button, like what Blizz did for Blade Flurry. Now, beyond that, I'd say I do feel that Arms is quite fun to play. I enjoy it quite a bit personally. I think its strength on 2 targets, that's something that's pretty cool and will remain. And, you know, the addition of this more reliable Cleave and the Ravager change, I think that's going to be really nice for their AoE toolkit as well. Now, the addition of some utility as well, with Die by the Sword dropping to a 2-minute cooldown, that should be an improvement over BFA. Certainly, I would say I've got my eye in this spec. I think it's a pretty cool one, although of course, a lot of this will be decided by the borrowed power, the legendaries, things like that in this expansion. Anyway, that's them. Let's talk about Fury. Fury, the last of our DPS specs. So Fury has seen a stack of minor changes. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. Enrage gives 15% extra haste instead of 25, and that does slow down the feeling of the spec, which really is not that fun. But I guess it does make being out of Enrage feel less slow by comparison, so that's potentially a benefit, but yeah, you're losing 10% of your haste there. Now, Bloodthirst's healing is also down to 3% from 5%, which hurts their sustain, which is a bit unfortunate. Then Recklessness, that now lasts 2 seconds longer, but still in the GCD, so that's not going to feel like great, is it? And then Rampage, that is down to 80 Rage from 85. Now, on the talent changes, Slam's return has prompted Fervor of Battle to reappear. Wrecking Ball is also here for your Whirlwind procs, and there's the new Enrage-only ability, Onslaught. Now, these replace Endless Rage, Carnage, and Meat Cleaver. It seems like this was largely to rebalance, though, rather than to change up gameplay, which I think is less exciting, but is still quite a valuable sort of change to be making. Now, in a notably positive change, Fresh Meat now ensures Enrage on the first Bloodthirst per target, and I think that is really quite good. Now, despite all of this, Fury does remain largely the same in terms of its core feeling, right? Smash Bloodthirst, Raging Blow, Whirlwind, do all that stuff till you can Rampage. You know, do the same in AoE, but like weave in your Whirlwinds to make your other hits cleave. I think it's far from exciting, but it is still pretty fast, and it's just simple, clean, messy fun. I don't know what clean, messy fun is, but apparently it's the Fury Warrior. I think it just has this rhythm, I suppose, of building and spending and going in and out of the flow of Enrage that is quite satisfying. As a total package, I'd say it works pretty well. Now, damage-wise, they've got a pretty reliable damage profile in most encounters thanks to their ability to spread their single target, but it's unlikely that they'll excel at any sort of given specific fight. I think that means that this is just a real safe pick across the board. It's got plenty of options to just help it, move in and out of different types of content. But really past that, I think if you are happy to manage your own self-sufficiency there or just trust your groups, then yeah, it's far from perfect, but I think it is a really, really fun spec. Alright, well, bloody hell, that was a lot of video, wasn't it? As it turns out, I don't think there's really any class that feels awful, right? I think there are a few that feel risky. Enhancement, right? That's up in the air. The resource change is a step forward, but it does not address the core issue of, the spec kind of living and dying on storm strikes. So that means that it could be over-reliant on, say, a single legendary or two to actually keep it up, right? So there's this single point of failure in the spec, which could reverberate through a whole expansion if it's not addressed. So, bit risky. Feral also pretty darn risky. The Blood Talons change, I think, is genuinely bizarre, and Sabretooth has not been touched despite the sheer contempt from the Feral Druid community towards it. I think these do betray sort of the lack of intent for actual change sometimes with Blizz. It still is a viable thing for most scenarios, it just is troubled. Then also, I wouldn't expect many to enjoy Survival Hunter. I couldn't really recommend it for any specific strengths. I mean, playing a Hunter for, range and maybe toying around with some survival is totally fine, yeah, but attempting to main survival, I think that is just... I think that's just starting with a bit of a disadvantage, to be honest with you. Now, for the best choices, we do have to mention the Havoc Demon Hunter, and I know that loads of people laugh at this, but look, it's obviously a versatile, strong spec. I think it's fundamentally a bit OP myself, and that's as somebody who mained it, but it does have a bit of a nerf to its survivability and things like that, but it still is super strong. Now, it also doesn't have the highest skill ceiling. Maybe you could use Momentum, or maybe Essence Break could be more of a thing, but assuming those are not the default gameplay, then it is basically just going to be this very reliable, pretty strong spec that just dominates in single target, dominates in AoE, doesn't have ramp up time, can do backflips, basically is just a super strong fundamental spec, which is what it's been for so long. I think there are some issues of fairness when you compare it to a whole bunch of other specs. That is somebody who, had mained it, so I would stand to lose if it was pulled down, but still, it is just a bit weird, right? It kind of stands apart in terms of its design from so many of the other specs, but of course, it still does have to perform just as well as the rest for it to actually be played. So an interesting situation, but certainly, to cut a long story short, all that stuff means you can't really go too wrong, unless the gameplay is boring to you. Then as we move on, Rogue is a nice enough pick if you don't mind being a bit squishy in straight up combat, right? I think each spec right now could use a decent bit more work, but Assassination is, I think, very close to being good, and Outlaw is perfectly playable as it is. And I think Rogues in general, right, they're always useful in dungeons, they're always useful in group content, and that's a very solid bonus for them fundamentally. then I think I'd almost always recommend the Paladin, right? I think it's really a standout pick of this group because of the utility, right? Nothing quite beats including lay on hands, right? I mean, that's very strong, but generally, right, it's got so many tools to be extremely useful in most content. I think that adds a lot of top end to the skill cap there. And, you know, the baseline additions to the rotation actually help it out quite a bit. And then also, this is obligatory, given that we're sort of in the land of the dead. If you fancy a Death Knight at all, then really Unholy is quite hard to ignore. It does have downsides, but I think it's actually one of the more, like, complete feeling specs in the game. I think it actually just feels really good, really solid. Of course, Frost is also pretty cool. So there you go, that is the melee DPS roundup, our opinions on all of them. As always, look, most of these specs will be viable for the vast majority of content. I think some are just more fun and more complete feeling than others. Some have fundamental issues, some other ones don't. And I think the risk involved is mostly perception or, you know, just the sort of worry of not having fun with one. So as always, the advice is the same, right? You've got to pick what you find to be the most fun to play, because that is what really matters. I think, though, what I'd like to know then is what specs sounded good to you as we move into Shadowlands. What do you plan on playing if you are into melee DPS? So let me know who you think is winning, who you think is losing in the Shadowlands changes. Let me know that down below. And I guess, yeah, just thanks for watching this video. I'm genuinely curious to see where, where all the different mains actually come into this video and sort of what they think about their specs. So there's that. If you want to check out Ranged, we've already done a video on that. Tank and Healer are upcoming. And if you want our spec and class specific videos, they are also on the channel too. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.